I feel like it's every person I ran into who's sitting here right now, so that's great. Al- Also, all of you people are menaces for building me up so much. I'm Raman. I'm here to talk about directives. I work at Shopify, all that jazz. This name is super long, and I wish I'd changed it, so don't pay too much attention to that. I made an agenda, and I hate agendas, so we're going to skip past because I don't want to see that. So what is a directive? That's what we're here to talk about. And it's relatively simple. It's just a decorator. You're going to put it on your schema or your query. And it's going to change the functionality, and you'll get some other power in there. But we'll see how that works in a bit. But that's kind of the shtick of what it is. And this is our dictionary definition as far as programmers are concerned of what a directive is. And it's incredibly descriptive. I'm sure this tells you everything you need to know. And it won't go any further than this, and we'll stop the talk right here. But not for me, so I just made a very contrived example. And this whole entire talk is contrived examples. So here's a GraphQL Summit directive. I chose the wrong color to draw onto here, and I didn't change this slide in time, so don't think about that. It has a little @ symbol. It's on a field there. There are sometimes arguments. I don't know why I made this one always true. That came up very early as well. So we'll just break it down a bit. So you have the little @ symbol, and I'm sure if you've seen a decorator before, that's really common, and I'm assuming that's where they got this pattern from. They have a name of some sort. Here I called it GQL Summit, and then sometimes you can have arguments. You don't need arguments, but you can pass them in. And they're all typed how you would expect them to be. So when I said directive, I'm sure some of you out there thought the directives I put in my schema, and then some of you thought the directives that I put in my queries, like skip or include, and those are both directives, and they're two different kinds of directives, and they have to do with locations, and there's also the types, and that's why I wrote location 3 times. So schema directives, those are the ones on your server, the ones that you've seen like deprecated, or any custom ones you would have added, or the ones you would use for federation, et cetera. And then there's query directives, like include or skip or defer or stream. And we'll dig into what these are and maybe what differentiates them. And that's why I mentioned locations, because that's really the thing that differentiates them, where they can be used on what parts of the different schema or query. And schema directives are really just transforming your schema. So you attach them to a field or an object or an input type, et cetera. And they're going to change it and change its functionality when the schema is created. And these are those locations I was talking about. And it's a really interesting list because it touches just about every corner of a GraphQL schema. But I find this really hard to look at. And I was like, oh, maybe there's like a visual representation. So I made a visual representation. So this is a ominous looking schema because it has one of every single thing you would have in a schema. And then these are all the locations. So they have objects, field definitions, argument definitions, interface. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how almost every little thing inside your schema can have a directive attached to it. And just an idea of all the different things you'll be able to do for each of these pieces. You could transform every little thing. You could change your whole entire schema with a directive, or build your whole schema with a directive, theoretically speaking. So query directives, the other side, the client side, or directives that are going to come into your server. So these are directives that are going to be put onto queries themselves. So skip or include, those types of things, where your clients are going to be the ones sending this to your server. But these are still implemented on your server. They're not implemented on the client. And the locations are similar, where they can be in just about every little corner of your schema, or sorry, query. So these are all the different places. When I made this, I decided to put the date on there, and I realized that I'm coming as a Canadian. It's day, month, year, and I feel like a lot of people here were going to think, oh, this is just not the right date, and I just wrote this from when I wrote the talk. But I can assure you that I wrote this talk very close to the current date. Okay, there was one little caveat, and I didn't know where to put this, so I thought I'd just shove this in here. Order is important. In the spec that you'll see if you just scroll down at some point, that the order that the directives are in is important, but they don't prescribe an order. So your implementation, whatever you might have your server in, is going to implement the order very differently. So it's just something to keep in mind. So it could be left to right, right to left, et cetera. So why directives, right? Why am I here? Why would we even use them? And there's a couple of reasons I came up with, and just to show you, et cetera. So modularity, I'd say is my favorite one. You have this single responsibility piece of code. It's just going to do one thing. It's highly visible on your schema. You can see exactly what it does. and it's perfectly reusable. So from an organizational standpoint, it's just a really great pattern, I would say. There's tons of use cases. And I had these use cases on here before I came here this week, but every person I talked to has used one of these use cases. So they're all out there, they're all real world. And one of my favorite one is logging. Someone out there was talking about how they added logging to their schema for new fields that they add. They'll add a little directive to it just to get usage statistics for that specific field. And they can take it out whenever they want. It's just this very specific niche use case. And I really love that. I think it's really cool. Value manipulation, we'll talk about that in a bit. Transforming fields, inputs, outputs, anything like that. Data validation, you could do that with a scalar, but you can also do it with the directives, maybe to hide it from your clients, right? They don't know how it's being validated, and that might help from a security attack perspective. Translation, this one's actually very close to us at Shopify, where I don't know if anyone saw Rob's talk. He actually created a directive called in context. So you can you can make a query to our public API, and you can pass in the they call it the locale that you want the response in, just inside that little thing, and it's really interesting, really nice. Caching, I'm sure there's people have seen a bunch of those out there. There's lots of caching directives. Data fetching, this one seems almost like it's just an example of how wild directives can get, but you can have a little rest directive on a field. Wow, that plane is so loud. Yeah, a little rest field where you can just fire off for the data for that specific field or that object or anything, right? Or you could go crazy and you could just have fetch a piece of data and then pass it off to the next directive and use that data to transform the field if you want to get unbelievably contrived, which we will. And then there's auth. I saw some people talking about auth directives and how useful these can be and then how unuseful they can be because they use too many, so that can get bad. And then finally, this is my favorite reason, or the whole reason I wanted to talk about this is language features, custom language features. So if there's something in the GraphQL spec that you don't like or that doesn't exist for you, you could just create it with a directive, or you could add it with a directive. And I found that really interesting. When people would put up a new proposal to the spec, they'll just create a directive and put it in there, right? Add that functionality, and then you can go through the whole steps and actually test it out and use it. And that's what happens with stream and defer, right? They were just proposals. They came out with these directives, and then it's going to get pulled into the language. It's really interesting. So those are all the reasons, or some reasons, or a few reasons. But there's directives you already know, and you use them every day, or I hope you use them every day. And the first one is skip, right? Skip's killer. We're going to skip these parts of the schema, query, if that Boolean value is true. And it's really valuable, right? You can reuse a query, all that. And then we have its evil brother, include, where you're only going to include this if that value is true. As you can see, I'm going to start a Raman theme to all of my examples. And I had to remake a lot of these examples because I kept writing my own name instead of Raman. And I don't feel as bad for all those. Well, I'm not as angry at all those people who accidentally wrote my name as the other one, but I'll never forgive them. We have defer. Someone was just talking about defer, so I won't touch on it too long. But here's a Raman feed with a simple Raman, and you have all the things that you would actually care about, like the toppings, et cetera. And then you have these meticulous notes, and I love meticulous notes, but we would probably defer them because you probably want to eat first, right? And this defer is just going to make it so this value comes in when it's ready, and you get this original value first. So this would be our original response, right? We'd get this first. These are the things that we care about, our UI cares about. And then later down the line, we'll get this extraneous data. And then stream is very similar, but we use it on lists specifically, right? Get an initial part of this list, and then the other parts of the list will get streamed into your service, again, depending on if your server supports all these things. And then here's our favorite and the OG deprecated, and it's I'm sure every single schema out there, and giving you a reason to not use these fields. And I always find out after I use authenticity. Oh, that should have been authenticate. And then I have to use authenticity v2. But they're already out there. You're using them, right? And why did I use them in the first place? Or how I had a production incident and I decided to solve it with a directive. So we can rewind 3 years. I'm young and full of life. And I get a call on a Sunday night. I had recently just implemented a GraphQL server, my very first one, at a company that had never used it before, so there was a lot of pressure. And my boss calls me and he's like, hey, can you get on a call? We have some weird requests coming into the server and we're getting some weird errors going out. And I was like, okay. So I get on the call. Oh, see, I should have been on one line. I get on a call and we're talking about it and we see that there's these, they almost look like shell commands coming in on an ID field for a product. We had a very similar e-commerce API. So my GraphQL server was just a middleware sitting in front of this legacy server, and we just had a fast-changing front end. So we decided, oh, this will be like our interim, and we'll create this API. So I learned about what an OS command was. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that before, because I hadn't. I didn't know what this was. But apparently it's an attack vector where someone can, hijack your input field. So in our case, it was just an ID field that took a string and pass in non-ID data. In our case, it was data to fish out the structure of our server. So luckily, they weren't actually able to fire off any shell commands, but they were getting errors that were very descriptive from our server, giving them some idea of what our server was like. So we didn't want that. So we put a patch in, but then we realized, okay, we might have to do some kind of sanitization here, right? Not make it so these IDs are directly passed to a legacy service. And I thought, well, this is a great time for me to keep experimenting because that worked out really well the last time. This is the query in question. It's super innocuous. Like, you wouldn't realize how bad it can be. And this is one of the OS commands, or an example OS command, right? It can fit into that ID field. It really is just a string. But in that legacy server, they get some data from us. So I thought, oh, I could implement sanitization in the resolvers, and I could put in all these resolvers in all these different places and make sure that we're using it, or I could use a directive. So I went with a directive, and that's how my sanitize directive got made the first time. It was relatively simple. It took a single argument, which is a pattern, just a regex, and it would just write a replace on whatever this input field was or whatever field you wanted it on for that regex pattern. And this is just the default. And you can see here, so this is, we'll create our own directive in a minute, but we just define it like this inside of our schema. And then in this case, I specifically put that I was putting it on input field definitions and argument definitions. And if you think back to earlier on, I have all those locations that it can be on, right? So a directive, you can zone it down to the specific areas where it can be used, right? And it can't be used anywhere else. And this is key for when you're implementing because each section of your schema is actually resolved very differently. And how you would manipulate it is very different as well. And this is how we used it. So we just threw it on to these fields. We would have some that are just using the default value, and you could pass in an actual pattern at some point too. This is not exactly what it was like. I wasn't sanitizing emails this way, but I could have been. So we're going to make our own directive, and it's not that hard, and it's not too bad. And now I'm getting into a baking theme. So we're going to create this Spicify directive. I feel like working at Shopify, it's really messed with my brain and how I name things, because I want to put if I at the end of everything, and I did do that. And we're just going to make it in an Apollo server context. So it's just JavaScript. We're going to use GraphQL tools just to make it relatively simple. So the first part of it is, again, a location, right? We're only going to use it on field definitions because we just want to affect some output data. Like it's our Spicify directive. We're just going to make things spicy and relatively simple. We're just going to add some pepper values to these things. And then we're just going to declare our directive. So here's what it would look like. And now you're thinking, oh, this looks very different than your first one. Why are you doing this? This is what I was reading about before, where let's say you start using a lot of directives and you have a very specific name for your directive, Spicify, which is a very common name that we're all sure of now. We want to make it so that we can change this name, mainly because in some other subgraph or anywhere else you're using it, you might have name conflicts, and obviously you can only have a single field of a single name. So having this name be changeable is very key, and it's just an easy way to future-proof that piece. Here we have an input, which is going to be level. So it's just something that's on our schema. It's an enum spice level, set to medium on default, and then it's on field definitions. So if we're going to go back and just think about those locations, right? So this one's specifically just on field definitions, just outputs, strings specifically in our case. But there's just so many places you'd be able to put something like this, and really opens up a world of opportunity. to hopefully inspire you to theoretically do it. So now we're rolling the dough. Mapping and logic. So how do we find out where a directive is, and how do we actually apply the logic of making things spicy? So here we have, there's our type definition that we had before. And then here we have this directive transformer. So I talked about before where schema directives are just transforming your schema. This is a really good way to think about how you're going to go through all these fields and you're just going to add this transform to it. So that map schema method comes from the GraphQL tools library. And it essentially takes your schema and a list of a map of transforms you want to commit to each kind of field, and then applies them, and then it gives you a schema that's reformed again after. So you can daisy chain these for each of your different directives. So here we're going for object field, but that's the one place where our directive can exist. This is a list of all the mapper kind places that you can actually affect, and you might notice that these are all the exact same places that a directive can live. So we're in there now, we have our field, we have to grab our directive. So this is going to go over every single object field in your schema, and hopefully you're not putting a directive on every single field. But in this case, we're going to try to grab it. So we're grabbing the specify directive here. We just pass in the schema, the field, and the directive name. So let's say we get it. We're going to pull off the resolve field from this field config, right? That's the specific field we're looking at right now where our specify directive was added. And then we're going to grab the little spice level from our directive, and we're going to overwrite this resolve function. So we call the function there, we get its result. In this case, if it is a string, we're going to concatenate our spice level onto it. I really got into this like spice thing at this point. I should have stayed on the bakery theme. So this also got away from me because there's no spices in baking. Oh, I guess there is like cinnamon. Okay, regardless, here's our spice. So we're just concatenating that on there. But you can see here, you have access to so much in the schema, in the current request that's coming in. You have the complete context here. You have access to the rest of the resolution, all the things that have happened before this point. It gives you a lot of power to add things, right? This is just an inspirational talk on why you should use directives. And then here's our whole thing. So it's ready, we're gonna use it. It's baking. I was gonna say cooking, and I kept reminding myself to say baking. So we're gonna implement this now. So we have our server, we're gonna define our schema. So first we were gonna add those type definitions into our schema, relatively simple. And then we have our queries, so we're gonna actually use our specify directive. So in this case, we have a regular take, which takes just a little medium spice. There's nothing too crazy there. Then we have a risky take, and this is a Twitter reply full level take. You know, you're saying something very obtuse. And then there you can see there's that enum that we're using before, that spice level. So, you know, we could have bundled that with our specify directive type definitions, but I decided not to, just to, you know, describe it here fully. So we take our schema, that schema we just defined, and we're going to apply our transform to it, relatively simple. But the nice thing about this transform is that if we had multiple schemas or a whole list, or sorry, multiple directives, you can keep applying the directives to that same schema because it just transforms them, gives you the schema back. And then we just pass in our server, and our server starts up. And then if we query it, our regular take is just a nice little bell pepper, and you have a scorching hot take, which is very spicy. But that's really it. When you have a very narrow scope for a directive like that, it can stay relatively simple, and you can implement it relatively simply and, you know, have it work well. I think the complexity really comes in is when you have multiple places in your schema where this directive can exist, because it's not as simple as overriding resolvers every time. They all resolve very differently. And it's fresh baked. Oh, that actually looks nicer than my official one. And here are some other directives in not JavaScript. You know, shout out to all my Ruby people out there. Well, I guess we're Ruby people too. So this is the deprecated directive and how it looks in there. So it's a little bit different. And we'll come back and talk about how code first will handle a directive, but our Ruby server being code first. And then for all the Golang people out there, I don't know why I included this one, but I thought it'd be nice just to get a different perspective. So we talked about directives, where I'm almost convincing you on directives, but maybe they're not that great. Maybe there's some things that are a bit of a caveat. and it's code for schemas. So when I was originally writing this, I was coming up to this point where I was like, all the non-SDL implementations are going to be very different. So you don't really get that visibility that I was talking about, where like your schema is describing all these fields and you're putting these directives in specific places, and you'll see that there, right? With a code for a schema, it's a little bit different, where we're not going to have that. We're not going to have these directives show up like this. It's really going to be more that you can attach them into those methods where you're creating those types, which is, it's fine, but it's not quite the same as this where you get to see it. And it's also very implementation dependent. There are some implementations that didn't support directives for a while. So it was very like, SDL is kind of first class on this, and code first was not as first class. But I feel like almost every implementation does have it now. But there are some inconsistencies. But the way, if you saw how we implemented it, we had that method for actually applying our transform, right? You could, in theory, just take that out and use that in your code first. So you still have that reusability if you wanted to use it across graphs. And there's type targeting, which is, I found this really interesting, where when we had our directive, we noticed how we put it on just a certain variety of types. In our case, it was field configs or field objects, which is fine. You can really bring it in and target just those specific things. But targeting specific fields in your schema is harder. So in this case, we're only trying to make ramen delicious. I also realized I'm saying my own name a lot during this talk, and I don't know how good that is. But we only want to make ramen delicious, and this directive goes on field definitions. Theoretically speaking, you can put it on every field definition in your schema. There's no way to stop you from doing that. You're not going to get feedback until you actually compile, right? So someone's going to try to make soup delicious, and it's not going to work. So there are ways to do it. You could do it inside that logic, but it is kind of working around this whole idea that it exists in your schema. So there is a bit of a caveat there. And you might notice that I didn't talk about query directives very specifically, and I didn't show any very complex examples. And that's why I'm coming back to what I was talking about before, where when it gets complicated, it gets complicated. When you're going to have multiple types where it can be applied to, and sometimes you have to bring scalars in to create a new type to apply those. So it's not always as simple as what we did, but once you have a narrow scope, you can have a very powerful directive, and it's not too difficult to maintain and create. But sometimes if you go too wide like that, the complexity does ramp up very quickly. And the query directives in a JavaScript-based implementation, for example, using GraphQL tools, there's actually not a very good example of how to do it. So I would like to see someone do that and tell me. So go out and try to use directives in summation. I probably should have written that too. Write a query directive. I'd love to see that. Try out some use cases like logging. That logging use case is so cool, and I really want to go do it. I probably will go do it after hearing that person talk about it. And then use the directives you have access to. Specifically, those include, skip, defer, all that stuff. It's fantastic. It's going to change the way you work, I'm sure. Or maybe don't use it too much. And that's it.